You know what's strange? You can sit at a dinner table, surrounded by the people who raised you, the same people who share your last name, your memories, your childhood home, and still feel completely alone, not lonely the way you feel when you miss someone. Lonely the way you feel when you realize that no one in the room actually knows who you are. And the hardest part is you cannot even explain it, because from the outside everything looks fine, there is food on the table, people are laughing, and you are sitting right there smiling at the right moments, but something inside you is quietly, completely, somewhere else. Psychologists have a name for this. They call it emotional estrangement, not the kind where you stop speaking to someone, but something quieter and in many ways harder to process. A deep internal disconnection from the people you are biologically closest to. Dr. Karl Pillemer, a sociologist at Cornell University who spent years studying family estrangement, found that this experience is one of the most underreported sources of adult pain, not because it is rare, but because it carries a specific kind of shame, the feeling that you should be grateful, that you have no right to feel this way, that your family is still there, so what exactly are you grieving? That question, that confusion, that is exactly where this begins. For most people, this feeling does not begin in adulthood. It begins in a moment so small they probably couldn't point to it on a calendar. Maybe you were the child who felt things more deeply than anyone around you, whose questions made adults uncomfortable, whose emotions were too big for the room or too quiet to be noticed. Maybe you had interests nobody shared, values that formed differently, a way of seeing the world that never quite matched the one your family was living in. And slowly, without cruelty, without anyone intending it, a gap opened between who you naturally were and who the family system needed you to be. Psychologist Murray Bowen, whose work on family systems theory remains one of the most influential frameworks in developmental psychology, described this as the process of self-differentiation, the degree to which a person can develop their own identity within a family system that may or may not have space for it. When that space doesn't exist, the child doesn't disappear, they simply go quiet. They learn to perform belonging while privately feeling none. Here is something worth sitting with. Every family operates on a set of rules. Almost none of them are ever spoken out loud. They are transmitted through atmosphere, through what gets laughed at and what gets ignored, through the topics that are always somehow never discussed, through the look someone gives you when you say something that doesn't fit. When a child's authentic self repeatedly collides with those invisible rules, something very specific happens neurologically. The brain, which is wired for belonging above almost everything else, begins to treat authenticity as a threat. Psychologist Dr. Gabor Maté has written extensively about this precise conflict, the choice the developing child faces between authenticity and attachment. And almost every time, attachment wins, because attachment is survival. So the child adapts, they edit themselves, they become extraordinarily skilled at reading the room, managing others' emotions, and presenting a version of themselves that keeps the peace. They become, in a very real psychological sense, a stranger to themselves, long before they ever feel like a stranger to anyone else. Now pause here for a moment, because this is the part that matters most and gets spoken about least. Spending your childhood performing a self that isn't yours does not stay in childhood, it follows you. Research in developmental psychology consistently links early emotional invisibility within the family to specific patterns in adulthood. A persistent background feeling of not quite belonging anywhere, a tendency to feel most like yourself only when alone, difficulty trusting that other people want the real you because the first people who were supposed to want the real you seemed more comfortable with the edited version. Dr. John Bowlby, the psychologist who developed attachment theory, showed that our earliest experiences of being seen or not seen become the internal blueprint we carry into every relationship that follows, not because we are damaged, but because the brain is efficient. It builds a model of the world from its earliest data, and it keeps using that model until something gives it reason to update. And here is where it gets the heaviest. There is a grief that comes with this realization. A very particular kind of grief that has no funeral, no casseroles, no socially acceptable mourning period. Psychologist Pauline Boss, who spent decades researching what she called ambiguous loss, described it as the grief of something that is present but emotionally absent. The grief of something that technically exists but never quite arrived in the form you needed. You did not lose your family, they are still there at the table. But somewhere along the way you quietly lost the version of that relationship you needed, the one where you walked in the door and the weight lifted instead of settled. where you could say the true thing and not immediately regret it, where being yourself didn't require so much careful management. Grieving that loss, a loss most people around you cannot even see, is one of the loneliest and most exhausting things a person can carry quietly through an entire life. And if you have never had language for it before, I want you to hear this clearly. What you have been grieving is real. It counts, even if no one ever held space for it. Here is what psychology keeps returning to about people who carry this experience, and it is not what most people expect to hear. The people who feel most like strangers in their family of origin are very often the ones whose capacity for depth, authenticity, and genuine connection exceeded what the system around them was built to hold. They didn't fit because they were always reaching for something real in an environment organized around something comfortable. Their sensitivity was not the problem. Their emotional range was not the problem. Their need to be actually known, rather than simply included, that was never the problem. It was always a signal of someone who was built for a different kind of belonging, a deeper kind, the kind that doesn't ask you to disappear in order to stay. So if you have spent your life feeling like a stranger at your own family's table, here is what the research, and something more honest than research, actually says. You are not too sensitive. You are not too complicated. You are not too much. You are someone who needed to be known, fully, without conditions, and that need is not a flaw. It is one of the most human things there is. Dr. John Bowlby, whose landmark research at the University of Chicago studied belonging and human connection across decades, found that the deepest human need is not just to be near people, it is to be understood by them. You are always looking for that. The fact that your first home couldn't fully offer it does not mean it doesn't exist. People build it, slowly, deliberately, with others who recognize them without requiring them to shrink first. Some people have to find their family rather than be born into it. And there is nothing tragic about that. There is actually something quietly extraordinary about a person who, after years of not being seen, still refuses to stop reaching for real connection. That kind of persistence, that kind of hope, that is not a wound, that is character. If this felt like something you have been carrying alone for a long time, leave a comment below.